Welcome. My name is Matt Allen. I'm the Director of Professional Development here at Land of the Sky Association of Realtors, or LOTSAR for short. I will be saying LOTSAR throughout the presentation, so I want to make sure everyone knows what I'm talking about. The purpose of today's event is to highlight the importance of fair housing and diversity, equity, and inclusion in our industry, while acknowledging our past to remind ourselves that we still have a long way to go. I'm so excited about the lineup of speakers that we've assembled today. Just to give you an idea of the agenda, we'll first have a Q&A discussion with myself and Sandra Kilgore, broker in charge of Kilgore and Associates Real Estate, Asheville City Council member, and NC State Senate District 49 candidate. We'll then have a Q&A discussion between Wallace Sheely, LOTSAR's 2022 president, and Alexia Smokler, who is the Director of Fair Housing Policy and Programs at the National Association of Realtors. And Alexia will be joining us via Zoom. She's in Chicago. Following an announcement, gift card winners of LOTSAR's Fairhaven Challenge. So the non-realtors here will not know what Fairhaven is, but you will by the end of the evening. Following that announcement, we'll then hear from our keynote speaker. So honored and lucky to have Richard Rothstein with us. And following Richard's remarks and the Q&A, please stick around for food, drink, and some mingling back there. With our agenda out of the way, everyone please welcome Sandra Kilgore.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. And thank you very much. I greatly appreciate the opportunity that the National Board of Realtors has given me to actually come and speak with you today. Matt has been a gracious host, and he's actually, I've been working with him for a while, and I've really enjoyed it. And I am so proud of what they have accomplished here to be able to get their own building. I mean, this right here, this is an accomplishment. This is what happens when you work together. And I tell you, I am so excited for them and for me, because I am a realtor here too. Thank you.
Well, Sandra, I would first like to talk about your feature in Realtor magazine from last spring. In the article, you share a story about witnessing urban renewal taking place in your neighborhood in Asheville in the mid-1960s. It was such a striking and sobering account, and I would love for you to talk a little bit more about that and what you believe can be done to perhaps rectify some of the harms caused by urban renewal.
I'm glad you asked that question because it brings back so many memories. And I tell people, growing up here in Asheville, I really enjoyed it as a child. It was so nice because we had communities. And the communities, people in the communities took care of each other. The neighbors, if you were a kid, you couldn't get out of line because your parents would know by the time you got home. And we respected the neighbors, that even though they, sort of got us in trouble, we still respected them. and that type of thing, relationship, you never forget. And so it's being a child and growing up and seeing that and being a part of that, where you could just walk around the neighborhood. And like I said, you were protected. And what had happened was, like I said, I was around 10 when they started taking it. In fact, it was a lady that lived 2 streets over on Maryland, on Merle Street. And what had happened, one of her house was, I think, one of the first ones taken. And at that time, I was babysitting for her. So when she sold her house and went to Kilgore, which basically was an upgrade for her, some people during that time, depending on their house value, were able to upgrade to better situations. And she was one of those families that moved to Kilgore. And then after that, I just saw it happening, neighbor after neighbor, just moving out of the community, houses being taken. And like I said, at that time, I didn't realize it was being taken. I thought everybody was moving on up, you know what I mean? So anyway, they had developed a housing development up the street, Erskine. And at that time, many of the families were moving there. That was new construction. And they were, many of them were happy to be moving there because they were told that they're moving there temporarily and, eventually they'll be able to get back to home ownership. And that has been like, 50 years later. And what has happened, it's actually become, I tell people, I looked at it as being transitional housing, but what it has become is permanent housing for generations of people that have never been able to get out of the quagmire and be able to get back on their feet. And I remember at that time when they were taking homes, and I wanted our home to be taken too. I was just waiting for it. And I kept asking my dad, when are they gonna take ours? When are they gonna take ours? And he'd always say, no, you don't want that to happen. I'm like, yeah. And I'm gonna share this with you because it's so funny. At that time, the only thing I could think about is being able to get the money to buy a manufactured trailer home and buy as many frozen dinners and Coca-Colas. That's all I could think of. I said, man, that would be a life, That to me was a life, and that's what I thought about. I laugh at that now, but yeah, it's, but that's through the eyes of a child. What can we do now to actually improve the situation? One thing that council is doing, I wanted to bring that up, is because what makes a community is the people in it. And what happened was right now, city council basically has housing development out of Deeperview. Basically, I think it consists of about 21 acres. And what had happened, we as a city own about 18 acres over at Cedar Hill. There became some land available, which is the Ford, 65 Ford Street. And basically, we were able to combine all of those properties in something like 56 acres. And what we're in the process of doing is doing a purpose-built community. That model pretty much is all over the state. It's been very successful. And I am looking forward to that because I think that's a first step in trying to sort of bring the family and the community back together. So I'm looking forward to that.
Awesome, thank you. In that same Realtor magazine article, you share a story about being discriminated against by a lender when purchasing a home in the early 1980s. Do you mind sharing a bit more about that experience?
I had had been hired on by the airlines, the Piedmont Airlines at the time, in 1976. I moved to Washington, D.C. I'd always taught because it's in my household, we lived in, it was 8 of us that lived in a 650 square foot home. That's where I was raised. And I'd always told my mom I was going to buy her a home, And once I got with the airlines, then what had happened was I wanted to buy a home, but because I never knew where I was going to be or what I was going to be doing, the best place to buy a home would have been in Asheville. So my younger sister called me up and said she wanted to show me a house that was her dream home. So I flew home and I looked at the house and I was like, okay, I want that house. And so what happened, I knew nothing about real estate, I knew nothing about financing, I knew nothing about nothing. So what I did was I called the realtor and asked to see the home. And she showed up, and then I walked to the home and I said, okay, I'll take it, what do I need to do? And she looked at me and she says, Ms. Kilgore, you haven't seen any other houses. And I mean, being a realtor, if somebody says, I want it, you're not gonna ask them, hey, you need to look around here. But anyway, and I was like, no, I just wanna see this home, I just want this home. So she pulled out a book, I remember at that time, because you had the big books you didn't have MLS. And she pulled out the book and she showed me homes, do I remember, but they were in Black neighborhoods. And she kept saying, look at this one, look at this one. And I said, no, I don't wanna look at any more homes. What do I need to do? So she said, well, you need to give me a deposit and do a contract. And so I had just fallen in town and I didn't really have any money, so I went and told my father. I said, how much do you need? She said, $1,000. I said, okay. So I went home to my father, and my father, you have fathers always have money packed back somewhere. You never know about it. And so he went and got me $1,000 and came and handed it to me. So I was like, okay, so I went and did the contract with the lady. I had no idea that you could negotiate, or I had no idea. I just said, okay, that's the price. Okay, that's fine. Okay, which turned out to be a good thing because what I did not realize at that time, there was another bidder, buyer on the line who basically was trying to negotiate. I was not negotiating. So once the people were able to get my contract, full price offer, or whatever, they jumped at it. So at that time, I flew back to Washington, and the realtor called me and says, well, Ms. Kilgore, I have someone to talk to you about the financing. And so anyway, she put the guy on the phone, and first thing the guy said to me is this: Ms. Kilgore, I don't know what your financial situation is. I don't know what your job situation is, but I do know to qualify for a house of this size that you need to make at least $40,000 a year, and you need to have at least $10,000 in the bank. So I knew then he was not the lender for me, because what he did was try to discourage me. So I told him, I said, no, I'll try to find my own lender. So I got on the phone, called banks down here in Asheville, and I remember I called Asheville Federal, and I spoke with the lady on the phone, and she was very gracious and very nice, and she said, oh yes, Ms. Kilgore, we can help you, okay, because I told her I was flying down. So, all these different little things flying down, she assumed that I wasn't black. So she was really gracious, and, so I flew down to meet her, and as soon as I walked in the bank, she looked at me and she said, are you Miss Kilgore? And I said, yes, I'm Miss Kilgore. So she said, Miss Kilgore, we can't help you at this time. She never asked for any financial information. I never filled out an application, nothing. In other words, I pretty much just said, thank you very much. And at that time, I realized it was going to be difficult, so I went through the telephone book, and I was able to find a small mortgage company by the name of Brown Mortgage. And it was a young girl that answered the phone, and I told her my situation, and she said, come in, I can talk, she met with me. And so she explained to me pretty much from beginning to end what the home buying process was, because I had no idea. And she told me what, she needed. And so I just sort of did everything she needed me to do. So we were able to get that home closed. I think my interest rate was somewhere like about 12 or 13%. But anyway, and the thing is, I never saw the real estate agent anymore. When I bought the home, I bought it for my mom and dad. So after I closed on it, I went home, gave them the keys, and I flew back to Washington. About 5 days later, my mother calls me and says, Sandra, no one came to take the sign out of the yard. Do we just leave it? And I said, no, Mom, take it out of the yard. They never showed up to take it out of the yard. I never saw the real estate agent anymore. Wow. And then my mom and dad found out later on, a gentleman down the street who purchased a house down the street told my mom and dad that he was in negotiations for the same house. But I had come in, I guess, and outbid him, so I was able to get it. And after that happened to me, I didn't realize how bad I was treated, but I knew I was not treated right. So what I did was I started here in Asheville, when I come visit my parents, I ended up going to a real estate school here in Asheville. And I would come down and take the courses or whatever. I was able to get my first real estate license here in 1981. I got with a small broker who actually, if you know what Westgate is, the property prospectors, Bob Proctor was my broker. And he was amazing. And so what I would do, I was flying in Washington. And when I come home, I would work in real estate here in Asheville. And that was in 1981. And I will say this, even though, like I said, I learned a lot when I went to real estate school, how bad I was treated. And when I started flying, I actually moved to Florida. And in Florida, I can tell you, I'm just going to share this with you. The racism was just as bad, if not worse. So I had to deal with that. I had to sneak clients in developments that they considered we couldn't get in. I'd have to slip them through the gates. We'd have to go up into the gates. And they had associations that wouldn't meet with us, associations that wouldn't unlock the pools, they wouldn't unlock the door. So it was a real experience dealing with that too. So for that reason, I've spent my whole life basically trying to help as many people as I can to actually have ownership, home ownership. A lot of my clients in Florida that I work with, they will tell you, they have been able to accumulate much wealth, and because they started with me. And every time people started with me, I was able to upgrade them to a better house or upgrade them to a rental property. And a lot of them have amassed, what I'm saying, a lot of wealth. And that was one thing I sort of want to do is help people because I realized how difficult it was for me. And I had a little education. Think of those that do not have any education. They may have the resources, but they don't have the education.
Thank you for sharing this experience. Last year, Evanston, Illinois became the first city to commit public funds to reparations for African American citizens. Several other cities have recently committed to creating similar programs. Such a program is being discussed here in Asheville. What do you envision that looking like, and what are the latest developments, if any, that you could share with us?
Yes. It's going to be challenging. I will say that. It's definitely something that was needed and something that they sort of just stepped out, to do. However, Evanston, Illinois was, because they had a financial source, to be able to sort of fund the different things that they wanted to do. Unfortunately, we don't have that here in Asheville. We have had a lot of tremendous pushback. I know council at first, we allotted something like $1 million for the process, but we were able to get that up from $2 million actually from the city, and we did get a lot of pushback from that. It's taken a lot more time than expected because, as you know, as far as reparations, this has been something that's been going on since 1865. Different people, I think John Conyers back in the 60s and 70s had introduced into Congress, basically trying to get reparations started. And Sheila Jackson, in the last few years, has that bill in Congress. But so it's been something that have been tried and worked on different levels. So it's going to be very challenging to be able to actually ensure it is a success. However, what we have done, we have amassed a council of 25 participants to actually work on that particular reparations committee. That committee is made up of 5 Buncombe County selectees and 5 from the city. And what we're actually doing, trying to select people that were more or less had expertise in different areas as far as housing, economic development, healthcare, and a different thing, criminal justice. So these are the people that we're trying to amass. And what we ended up doing was taking 2 people from each of the affected communities. So now we have 25 people that are basically assigned to the commission. We have 7 alternates, and that they're having their first meeting probably the first week in May. So, and we're not really making any suggestions or any, of which direction we should go, because we're going to allow the process to work with the professional people we put in place. So hopefully, and one other thing that we have done here in the city, as you know, we have a hotel, the benefit table. And what happens with the hotel, we have a hotel overlay, of course, and that protects different areas that were affected through gentrification or whatever as being more damaged through, that type of development. So we have an overlay system that protects that. But we also put in a benefit table. The benefit table actually allows a lot of the hotels to be able to fast track. And when I say fast track, that means they don't have to go through all those different levels if they donate money towards affordable housing, reparations, and there are a few other options for them to choose. So that in itself is definitely will help us raise some money, but still it's not nearly enough. We're in the process now with council because we do have a lot of apartments coming in. And basically, we hope to be able to get implemented the same benefit table, which actually, because to be able to get money to fund affordable housing and reparations. And unfortunately, because we cannot actually prevent hotels from coming in, we can't prevent apartments from coming in. but we can sort of, set in certain criteria where we can benefit, and that's what we're trying to do.
Wonderful. Sandra, can't thank you enough for being here today. I have one final question. What role can realtors play in helping to undo the harm caused by discriminatory housing practices?
I think we as realtors, what we really can do, I thought about that question when you asked me that. And I actually feel that education, part needs to be sort of expanded. Because basically people, even if they buy a house and they don't understand the commitment that they put in or the responsibilities of taking care of that property, then you set them up to fail. So I think that we all should, and I would love to see the Board of Realtors put out something sort of beginning to end package that we could give these clients and maybe go over it with them, And I think that would be able to more or less make homeownership not only something that we expand on, but be able to make it sustainable.
Thank you so much. Sandra Kilgore. Well, I'm going to do a quick intro for Alexia. So if you're a realtor, her reputation precedes her. But for non-realtors, I just want to share a little bit about her. Alexia Smokler represents NAR's positions on fair housing to Congress, federal agencies, and leads NAR's ACT initiative, which emphasizes accountability, culture change, and training to advance fair housing in the industry. She led the development of Fair Haven, a fair housing simulation, and bias override, overcoming barriers to fair housing. Alexia also oversees NAR's discrimination self-testing program for real estate brokerages and NAR's fair housing licensure reform efforts, among other projects. Alexia serves as staff executive to NAR's Fair Housing Policy Committee and writes and speaks regularly on fair housing issues related to real estate audiences around the country. Also, I would be remiss not to mention that Alexia wrote the Realtor magazine article I was referencing with Sandra. That article is now a finalist for the Jesse Neal Award, considered the highest editorial honor in business journalism. And Alexia will be attending an event in New York City next week to find out if she wins. So I think I can speak for all of us when I say we're sending out good vibes. Thank you so much for being here, Alexia. I'll turn it over to Wallace Sheely for the Q&A.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks so much. It's great to be with you.
Isn't Matt doing a wonderful job with his presentation? Alexia, welcome. Most of us in the room here have read The Color of Law, and we're really excited to hear Richard's presentation in a few minutes. We know that you're a bit of a history buff, and you uncovered some history while writing the article about Sandra in our own town of Asheville. Would you tell us briefly about how the real estate industry has been reckoning with its own past of discrimination?
Thank you, Wallace, and thank you, Matt. I'm so happy to join you today, and I only wish I could be there in the mountains with you to meet two people who have my utmost respect, Sandra Kilgore and Richard Rothstein. Sandra, your story is so powerful, and it was my honor to write about you. From seeing the destruction of Black communities in Asheville during urban renewal as a child, to experiencing housing discrimination yourself that motivated you to get your real estate license, serve people better, putting your office where most folks wouldn't, to be a role model to people in that low-income community, and you are. We are so fortunate to have you as one of our own, and I wish you all the best in your future endeavors. So I think everyone in this room understands, especially if you've read Richard's seminal work, that the racial homeownership gap, a chasm of 30 points between Black Americans and whites, same as it was before passage of the Fair Housing Act. And these segregated communities that so many of us live in, they're not just the natural consequence of people's individual choices. The history that you're about to hear from Richard explains how government at all levels systematically shut people of color out of homeownership and thriving communities. The real estate industry, the appraisal industry, we were active participants in these processes. We championed the idea that the presence of Black people and certain immigrant groups lowered property values. We didn't have any evidence for that idea, but we put it in our code of ethics anyway. A member of this association could be disciplined if they sold a home to a Black person in a white neighborhood from the 1920s through the 1950s. Based on those unproven theories, we advised the federal government on its redlining maps and its FHA underwriting manual. We led campaigns to insert racially restrictive covenants into deeds, and we sued home buyers and sellers to enforce them. And of course, we vigorously opposed passage of the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Over the decades since then, our industry has come around. First, reluctantly, but now we have a real groundswell of support. A lot of folks have read Richard's book to examine our history and do what we can to repair the harm. Last year, our president issued a formal apology for the role our industry played in these practices. Now, an apology isn't enough, but it's important to take responsibility. Your local government has done that in Asheville as well. We featured those events in our Realtor Magazine story about Sandra. I speak with realtor associations all over the country, and I share this history with them. We own it. So the next step is to take stock of the impact of all those lost opportunities to build intergenerational wealth and marshal the resources we have today to close those gaps. I know Richard is involved in this work, and realtors all over the country are partnering with him. Wallace?
We can't understand the present without knowing about our past. And we were still dealing with many of those challenges. The Newsday investigation in 2019 came as many of us took stock in our industry. Maybe some were shocked, others maybe not. How did the National Association of Realtors respond to the Newsday investigation?
So some of you may know that in November of 2019, a newspaper on Long Island, New York, called Newsday, published a hidden camera investigation about discrimination by real estate agents. And it rocked us. The investigation found that real estate agents treated testers posing as home buyers. They treated the white tester and the tester of color differently in 40% of their interactions, almost half the time when the tester was Black. Those videos showed us that we needed to do better. We needed to hold ourselves to a higher standard. We saw those videos and we knew this isn't just a New York problem. We've seen real estate discrimination documented in testing studies conducted by the government, by research institutions. Now, it just so happens that 3 weeks before publication of that investigation, NAR had hired the head of fair housing enforcement at HUD, my current and former boss, and Richard Rothstein's good friend, Brian Green. And so NAR was well positioned to respond. We had a strong civil rights advocate on our team. Brian immediately proposed this new initiative for a leadership team, and they adopted it right away. We named it ACT. It's an acronym that stands for Accountability, Culture Change, and Training. Part of it is to make sure that we hold real estate professionals accountable when they violate fair housing law, but also we want to shift hearts and minds. so that equal service is just woven into the way we serve the public. And so that when we say that realtors hold themselves to a high ethical standard, upholding fair housing is core to that. Wallace?
Tell us more about the National Association's Act Fair Housing Initiative. What is the accountability piece all about?
So real estate discrimination is often hidden. It can be done with a smile. A person who is discriminated against may never know that they were treated any differently from somebody else. And so relying on complaints alone to enforce the law just isn't enough. We think it's important to proactively take steps to find out if discrimination is occurring. We advocate here in Washington for increased funding for HUD's fair housing enforcement programs, including testing. And we've launched our own self-testing program for brokerages who want to check their own agents' compliance with fair housing law. Also, on the accountability front, we've reviewed the real estate licensure laws of all 50 states. There is great variability among the states in terms of how much fair housing training they require for a real estate license and what kind of discipline a licensee receives if they engage in a fair housing violation. Some states don't require any fair housing training at all. And although many realtors think they may lose their license if they get caught engaging in discrimination, that is rarely the case. So we're working with our state associations to encourage them to take a look at their own licensing law to ensure that we're holding ourselves to the highest standard. And to advance legislation, if necessary, to strengthen their law. Wallace?
NAR has introduced some really excellent fair housing training since the Newsday study. Tell us more about the implicit bias training.
So back in 2020, we released a 50-minute training video about implicit bias in real estate. And this month, we're launching a 3-hour classroom course on implicit bias that we've made ready for continuing education credit. What is implicit bias? It's the way that our brains automatically and often without our awareness attribute stereotypes to people that we're not familiar with. We all do it. It's the way our human brains work. It's a shortcut. Helps us categorize things quickly and make sense of all the information coming at us. It can be a problem because if we haven't had a lot of exposure to people from other groups, those shortcuts are based on images we get from media and culture. They aren't true. And so even as our conscious minds may hold fairness and equal treatment as cherished values, our unconscious minds may be causing us to treat people differently or unfairly without our even intending to. And that can lead you down the road to a fair housing violation. You're making assumptions about people based on their identity. That could lead you into steering people to different neighborhoods based on their background. It could lead you to denying some people equal service. And so we want all realtors to be very careful that they aren't letting those mental shortcuts make bad decisions. So our new classroom training is going to teach agents tactics to interrupt that stereotypical thinking so that they can treat every customer or client as an individual with equal respect, concern, and service. So watch for that classroom training from a licensed provider of our content near you. And also watch for additional implicit bias videos that we'll be releasing later this year.
One more question. I am sure with your work on the new training that it'll have the same hallmarks that Fairhaven has. Alexia played a key role in its development. We're going to be presenting our Fairhaven Challenge awards here in just a minute. Can you tell us more about realtors, why they developed the training, and what goals are went into its development?
Sure. So Fairhaven is really a new approach to fair housing training. There isn't anything else like it out there. We decided to create it not long after Newsday was published. We saw in more than one of those hidden camera videos agents referencing their fair housing training. They talked about what they weren't supposed to do, like steering. They named it. They said, I'm not supposed to, and then they did it anyway. Something wasn't connecting. We could see that we needed a new kind of fair housing training, something that really resonated to teach not only the substance of the law, but also that would move more agents to embrace it. And so that's how we came up with Fairhaven. It's not your traditional lecture or quiz. You will not need to know what year any law was passed or memorize any provisions. We wanted to give members a chance to practice applying fair housing principles in scenarios that feel real. And so in Fairhaven, you'll go into a fictional town. You have to sell 4 homes in 6 months, and you'll encounter various types of discrimination along the way. As we developed this training, we reviewed real fair housing cases and talked to members about their frequently asked fair housing questions. Now, a very special feature of Fairhaven is that the learner is also put in the position of a client on the receiving end of discrimination. You'll see things from that client's point of view and confront the decisions that that person would have to make. The goal here was to elicit an emotional reaction in the learner, to open the learner up to new perspectives that they hadn't encountered, and to evoke empathy and behavior change. So we've set the bar really high with this training. It's our goal for learners to come out of it seeing the world a little differently. And learners have told us that they got angry or tearful when experiencing the client's point of view. They've told us that this training was really impactful to them and their business. So I want to thank the Land of the Sky Association for launching its competition, and I want to congratulate all the winners.
Alexia, it was a pleasure speaking with you. I want to wish you the best of luck. No, take that back. I am sure that you're going to come away having won this award next week. And thank you for being with us, for all you do for fair housing, the industry, and for being with us today. Thank you very much.
Okay, so now we know what Fairhaven is, if you didn't before. And so we launched our challenge beginning in January, and we said that we would give the winners a $50 gift card. And we drew 10 people at random. So if you're here, you hear your name called, collect it after. If you're not here, shame on you. It's you, I guess, but should have been here. Yeah. Randall Barnett. Michelle Dover. Athena Dagger. Suzanne A. Alan Ford. Is Alan Ford not here? Deb Francis. Andrew Gerard. Hillary Paradise. Liz Wiederholt. And Irina White. So congratulations. We'll make sure that we let you. And next, I'd like to call our very own Nadine Hussey up to introduce our keynote speaker, Richard Rothstein.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. And welcome to our fair housing event. I have the honor of introducing Mr. Richard Rothstein, who's the author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How the Government Segregated America. Richard's areas of expertise are education, race and ethnicity, and Richard is the author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, and this book was published in May of 2017. The Distinguished Fellow of the Economic Policy Institute, the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and the Haas Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. Mr. Rothstein is also the author of Grading Education, Getting Accountability Right. That was published in 2008. And Class in Schools Using Social, Economic, and Educational Reforms to Close the Black and White Achievement Gap. That book was published in 2004. The Way We Are, Myths and Realities of American Student Achievement. That book was published in 1998. The Charter School Dust Up, Examining the Evidence on Enrollment and Achievement, co-authored in 2005. And All Else Equal, Are Public and Private Schools Different? That was co-authored in 2003. Without further ado, please welcome Mr. Richard Rothstein.
Thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for coming here this afternoon, this evening, to engage with me in this conversation. You in North Carolina know better than most other Americans that in the 20th century we had a civil rights movement in this country. It actually began by challenging segregation in law schools, and then went on to challenge segregation in colleges and universities. And then in 1954, persuaded the Supreme Court to prohibit legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. And that Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954 gave impetus, stimulus, inspiration to a movement of activists. They engaged not just in lawsuits, but in marches, demonstrations, civil disobedience. People lost their lives in that struggle. Many were injured. Many exhibited great courage, both blacks and whites. But by the end of the 1960s, that civil rights movement had pretty much persuaded much of the country, not everybody, but much of the country, that racial segregation was wrong, it was immoral, it was harmful both to African Americans and to whites, that it was incompatible with our self-conception as a democratic society. With that understanding, and with the activism of the civil rights movement, it ended segregation in public accommodations, led by 4 courageous students in Greensboro, North Carolina. It ended segregation in public transportation, led by the courage of Rosa Parks in Alabama. And in the wake of the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it succeeded in getting a Fair Housing Act passed that prohibited ongoing discrimination in the sale of rental housing. And then the civil rights movement ended and left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. Every city is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. Every one that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that were all white and mostly white, clearly defined areas that were all black or mostly black. How could it be? If we came to an understanding that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both African Americans and whites, incompatible with our self-concept as a democratic society, how could we leave untouched the biggest segregation of all? Well, partly, I guess, it's because undoing residential segregation is hard. If we ended segregation in lunch counters or in buses, the next day you can go to any restaurant you want. You could sit anywhere you want on a bus. But if we end segregation in neighborhoods, the next day things would look much different. So what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, blacks, whites, liberals, conservatives, northerners, southerners, we've adopted a national myth, a rationalization that we give ourselves, an excuse we give ourselves for not addressing the biggest segregation of all. And that myth goes something like this. We tell ourselves that the segregation of colleges and universities and public accommodations and public transportation and schools, that was all done by government. If the federal government, for example, was requiring passengers on trains to go to segregated cars whenever they crossed the Mason-Dixon line, it was a Fifth Amendment violation, a violation of the Constitution, something that every one of us as Americans has an obligation to remedy. If state and local governments were requiring segregation of restaurants or buses, that was a 14th Amendment violation. Also something that we as Americans have an obligation to remedy. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves, well, that's something entirely different. That wasn't done by government. That wasn't done by law, by regulation, by ordinance, by public policy. That just sort of happened naturally. It happened by accident. It happened, oh, it's true, by bigoted white homeowners or landlords who wouldn't sell or rent to African Americans in white neighborhoods, or private businesses like realtors, real estate agents, banks, developers, insurance companies that discriminated in their purely private sector activities. Or maybe it happened because people just like to live with each other of the same race. We feel more comfortable that way. That's why we're segregated. Or maybe it's all the result of income differences. On average, African Americans have lower incomes than whites, not everyone, but on average they do. And so many African Americans can't afford to move to middle class white neighborhoods. All of these individual, bigoted, discriminatory, self-choice, economic trends, all private, not government directed, is what's created residential segregation. And we tell ourselves what happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. What happened naturally can only unhappen naturally. We give a name to this rationalization. We say it's de facto segregation, something that just happened in fact, not in law. Well, as you heard from the introduction, I spent a lot of time before I began to address this topic of writing about education policy. And increasingly, my address audiences, most people are too young to remember even the 1990s, but most of you will remember that in the 1990s and 2000s, we had a national education view shared across the political spectrum. That, of course, we had an achievement gap between black and white children. Black children achieved in school at on average, at lower levels than whites. And we told ourselves that the reason for this achievement gap was that teachers of black children were lazy. They didn't try very hard. You're laughing. This was a national policy. And if only we could force teachers to try harder, the achievement gap would disappear. Well, I thought this was a ludicrous view. I wrote article after article about it. But it was enacted into national law. In 2001, we passed a law called the No Child Left Behind Act, which required children to be tested every year, and their test scores reported by race. And the theory of the law was that teachers looked at these test scores and saw that the black children were achieving at lower levels than white children. They would try harder, and the achievement gap would disappear in 7 years. Well, it's 20 years later. The achievement gap is still basically where it was. The only thing that the No Child Left Behind Act accomplished was it got teachers and schools to abandon a well-rounded curriculum so they could spend more time preparing children to take tests. The achievement gap hasn't budged. Well, as I say, I wrote an article about this, and I tried to explain that the reason we have an achievement gap in schools is not because of lazy teachers. Of course, there's some lazy teachers. There's some lazy real estate agents, I assume. But that's not the main reason we have an achievement gap. The reason we have an achievement gap is because so many black children come to school with social and economic disadvantages and impede their ability to learn. And I remember writing one column about asthma. And as you may know, in this country, African American children have asthma at a much higher rate than white children. In some cities, as much as 4 times the rate. They have asthma at such a high rate because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more industry near their homes, more unpaved streets, more dilapidated buildings, more vermin in the environment. And in this article, I tried to explain that if you had 2 groups of children, two groups of children, identical in every respect, same racial composition, same social and economic background, same family structure. But one group had a higher rate of asthma. That group was going to have lower average achievement because the children, some of them, would be up at night wheezing and coming to school drowsy the next day. And drowsy teachers, drowsy children, on average, don't achieve a high level as wide-awake children. Well, asthma is not a big cause of the achievement gap, but when you begin to think of all the other social and economic challenges that African American children come to school with at greater rates than white children, lead poisoning has a measurable impact on IQ, homelessness, evictions, economic insecurity. You begin to add all of these up, and that pretty much explains the achievement gap, and there won't be very much left to explain lazy teachers. Just a little bit. Well, it's one thing if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity. It's another thing if you have a school where every child has one or more of these challenges. How can such a school ever be expected to achieve at the same level as a school where children come well-rested, well-nourished, and economically secure homes? You can't expect that, no matter how many laws you pass to require it. Well, we call schools where we concentrate children like that, with these disadvantages, we call them segregated schools. And schools are more segregated in this country than they have been in the last 25 years. And the reason they're more segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are more segregated. So I began to think, I was still only thinking about education policy. I began to think that school segregation, neighborhood segregation was a school problem. Neighborhood segregation was a school problem, not a housing problem. And I began to think further about it. And then, in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision. The Supreme Court evaluated a policy that took place in both Seattle, Washington, and Louisville, Kentucky. It was a desegregation policy. They gave parents the choice of which school in the entire district their child would attend. But if the choice was going to intensify segregation, that choice wouldn't be honored in favor of one that did not do so. So if you had, for example, an all-white or mostly white school, you had one place left, and both the black and the white child applied for that master remaining place. The school was predominantly white, the black child was given some preference for that school. Trivial program. You don't have one place left very long. Choose between the black and the white applicant. But the Supreme Court evaluated this program, denounced it, said you couldn't do such a thing, said it was a violation of the Constitution to try to fix segregation in this way. The opinion was written by Chief Justice John Roberts. The Chief Justice explained. He said it's true, schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated. He said the reason they're segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. Wise observation on the Chief Justice's part. And then he went on to explain that the neighborhoods are segregated for the reasons I gave before. Private bigotry, discrimination by private businesses, people wanting to live with each other of the same race, economic differences, de facto segregation. And he said, we have de facto segregation, something that government did not create. Government is prohibited under the Constitution to try to fix it. Well, I read this decision and I remember reading about something that happened some years before in one of those cities, Louisville, Kentucky. In Louisville, Kentucky, there was a white homeowner living in a single-family home in a suburb of Louisville called Shively. That white homeowner had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran, had a wife, a child, good job, wanted to move to a single-family home, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner in this suburb of Asheville bought a second home and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry mob of white residents surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. The police made no effort to stop it. They dynamited and firebombed the home. The police made no effort to stop it. But when this riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence a white homeowner for sedition for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. The police, the courts, the entire criminal justice system, these are agents of the state. This was a massive 14th Amendment violation that was never undertaken the responsibility to remedy. And I began to look into it further, and I'm not exaggerating when I use this number. There were hundreds and hundreds of cases like this of police protected, sometimes police organized and led mob violence in virtually every metropolitan area of this country in the mid-20th century, designed to drive African Americans out of homes that they legitimately purchased or rented in white neighborhoods. Every one of these, where the police was involved in protecting, organizing, or leading mob violence, was a 14th Amendment violation. Every one of us gives each one of us, every one of them gives each one of us an obligation to remedy. It's an obligation that we have never accepted. Well, I began to look into it further then, and I soon discovered that there were many, many federal, state, and local policies, also racially explicit, designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live with one another anywhere in this country, designed to create an apartheid society, successfully create an apartheid society. So let me, in the few minutes I have with you this evening, describe a couple of the most powerful federal policies that were followed in order to ensure that we be an apartheid society. Perhaps the most powerful one was a policy of the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration in the post-World War II period. For those of you who don't know, World War II ended in about 1945. In the post-World War II period, designed to move the entire white working class and lower middle class population out of urban areas into single-family homes in white suburbs like that one outside the Louisville that I described before. At the time, we were not a suburban country. There were very, very few working class families, middle class families living outside of urban areas. I'm sure Asheville was a very small town at that time. They were living in urban areas because we were a manufacturing economy, making things. None of this internet stuff. We were all manufacturing things, and factories had to be located near before the ports and railroad terminals to get their parts and ship their final products. Most workers didn't have automobiles to get to work. They had to live close enough to work to be able to walk to work or maybe take short streetcar rides. So workers in these factories, both black and white, workers at the employees of the banks that service them and the other industries that service them, all had to live in a downtown area, an urban area. I'm not suggesting that every other house was a different race, but they were broadly integrated areas in many cases. The Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration decided to move the white families, not the black families, out of those areas into single-family homes in all white suburbs. And they did so. We became a suburban country as a result of this federal policy. We were not a suburban country before. The suburbs were like the one outside Louisville that I described before, were created everywhere. Perhaps the most famous of them, I write about this one in my book, The Color of Law, by Philip K. But this was the most famous, is a development outside New York City called Levittown. You've probably heard of it. 17,000 homes. 17,000 homes in this development. You might not have for a client. Levitt wanted to build this project. He went to banks, couldn't get a loan to buy the land or build the housing. No bank would be crazy enough to lend him the money to do this. They thought nobody would want to live in these suburbs. We probably moved out of the city. He couldn't get a loan to do it. The only way he could get a loan to do it, this is true of the developers in all of the subdivisions around the country in every metropolitan area. The only way you could do it is by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, requesting a federal bank guarantee of his loans. In order to do that, he had to submit his plans for the development, the materials he was going to use in construction, the layout of the streets, and a commitment to sell a home to an African American required by the FHA. The FHA even required them to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was a federal requirement. It wasn't the action of rogue bureaucrats working in the FHA or VA, although As in many industries in this country, there was a revolving door between the real estate industry and federal employees when it came to housing. But this was a written federal policy. The Federal Housing Administration published something called the Underwriting Manual that was distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job was to evaluate the application of these builders to build subdivisions. The manual said you could not recommend for a federal bank guarantee the application of a developer who was going to include African Americans in the suburban development. The manual went so far as to say you couldn't even recommend for a federal bank guarantee a loan to a developer of an all-white project if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living. Because in the words of the federal policy manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. And in my book that I think we're giving a copy, there's a photograph of a 6-foot-high, half-mile-long concrete wall that the developer in Detroit, outside Detroit, had to construct to separate this project from the neighborhood where African Americans were living before the Federal Housing Administration would guarantee his loan to build this project. This went on all over the country. This is how we got to be suburbanized. These homes were really expensive. And I say they were working class homes. These were people working in factories, returning war veterans who had jobs in the post-war economy. They were affordable easily to both African Americans and to whites. They sold at the time, Levittown, and the prices are similar in the number in any of the others that I've looked at. Homes in Levittown at the time sold for about $8,000. In today's money, inflation adjusted, that's about $100,000. Anybody with a job, a full-time job, and in the post-war economy, both blacks and whites, could afford a home like that. Returning war veterans required no down payment. But only whites were permitted. African Americans were prohibited from participating in this. Well, these white families who bought those homes didn't think they were buying it to become wealthy. They were buying it to have a place to live. But what happened, unexpectedly, was over the next couple of generations, those homes appreciated in value. And you can no longer buy a home for $100,000 in the suburb of this country. They sell for, depending on the area of the country, excuse me, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000. In some places, $1 million or more for $100,000 homes. White families who bought those homes gained equity as the homes appreciated in value. They gained wealth. They used that wealth to send their children to college. They used to perhaps finance temporary emergencies like temporary unemployment or maybe a medical situation. They used to finance their retirements, and of course they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited by federal policy from participating in this program that turned out to be a wealth-generating program. The result is that today, African American incomes in this country are about 60% of white incomes on average. There's a whole story behind that. Really bad but who would think if there was a 60% income ratio, there'd be a 60% wealth ratio as well? People would save the same amount of money from the same incomes. But in reality, although African American incomes on average are about 60% of all incomes, African American wealth is only about 5% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing laws. There was practice in the 20th century. I'm repeating myself, but I'm saying that we've never remedied that we as Americans have never accepted the responsibility we have under our Constitution as American citizens to remedy. Well, that wealth gap is perhaps the most important determinant of much of the racial inequality we have in this country today, not just in Iowa. I explained at the beginning how it's the cause of the achievement gap in schools. African Americans are locked into neighborhoods which are poorly sourced. They have no wealth for down payments in homes and higher opportunity neighborhoods. Children in those schools are overwhelmed by social and economic challenges such as I described. It's responsible, the wealth gap, it's responsible for health disparities between African Americans. African Americans, on average, have shorter life expectancies, greater rates of cardiovascular disease, because frequently, not every case, frequently, they're locked into neighborhoods that are more polluted, as I described before, neighborhoods that no access to grocery stores that sell fresh food. It's responsible also for the mass incarceration of young men, disproportionately African American in this country. Highest rate of incarceration in any country in the world. It's responsible for it because when you lock the most disadvantaged young men into single neighborhoods without access to good jobs or the transportation to get to them, or access to the schools that aren't overwhelmed by the social and economic problems of their children, it's inevitable that police are going to engage in confrontations with them. It's inevitable that police will adopt the tactics of control to the characteristic of police forces in colonial countries, in India, the Congo. When police are charged with the responsibility of keeping a disadvantaged population under control. And the wealth gap that was created by this federal policy is also responsible for something else that I think is very frightening, dangerous. And that is the enormous political polarization we have in this country today. It's not entirely racial, but you all know it largely tracks racial lines. How can we ever expect to develop a common national identity we need to preserve this democracy? So many African Americans and whites live so far from each other that we have no ability to, as Alexia said, overcome those stereotypes, get to know each other, empathize with each other, get to understand each other's life experiences. How can we ever develop a national identity that's necessary to preserve this democracy under those circumstances? Well, we can't. Let me describe one other federal policy that also contributed to segregation. It's something that I think most of us misunderstand. I did before I started this research. Public housing. We think of public housing as a place where poor people live, lots of single mothers with children, lots of those young men without jobs in the form of economy. That's not how public housing began in this country. When public housing began in this country in the New Deal during the Great Depression, the Roosevelt administration, poor people weren't permitted in public housing. We had a 25% unemployment rate in the Depression. Public housing was 75%. They had jobs. They couldn't find housing because there was so little private sector activity going on to construct it. So the first public housing in this country, built for middle-class, working-class families in the 1930s, was created by the federal government. And when it created it, it segregated it. Frequently, segregating those neighborhoods I described before, those urban neighborhoods that hadn't been segregated before. Some of you, I hope, many of you, I hope, will have read the autobiography of the great African-American poet, novelist, playwright, Langston Hughes. You've probably heard of him. Langston Hughes describes in his autobiography how he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. That's not how we think of downtown Cleveland today. He says he grew up in the downtown integrated Cleveland neighborhood. He said his best friend in high school was Polish. Said he dated a Jewish girl in high school. It was an integrated high school, an integrated neighborhood. The Public Works Administration, the first New Deal agency to build public housing in this country, went to that neighborhood, demolished housing, and built two separate projects. One for whites, one for African Americans, creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. During World War II, the government's efforts to segregate the country intensified because hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of war production to take jobs in war industries, jobs that had been scarce during the Depression. And when these workers, black and white, flocked to the centers of war production, if the government wanted the ships and the tanks and the aircraft carriers and the planes to be produced, it had to find housing for these workers. So it did. Every one of these war plant cities, the federal government built housing for war workers, always segregated, separate projects for whites, separate projects for African Americans, frequently workers working in the same war plants. but having to live housing, live separately, because that's how the federal government built housing. This is how the West Coast came to be segregated. So you know the history of the migration of African Americans out of former slaveholding states into the rest of the country know that African Americans didn't really migrate to the West Coast prior to World War II. They came to the eastern cities out of the South during World War I to take jobs then, but it began for African Americans moving to the West Coast in World War II. In San Francisco, the federal government thinks of itself as a liberal smoke place. In San Francisco, the federal government built 5 projects for war workers, mostly shipyard workers. 4 of them were whites only. 1 was for African Americans, placed in the neighborhood that became the African American neighborhood of San Francisco. Across the bay, in Berkeley and Albany, one of those, Albany, California, just a suburb just north of Berkeley, another one of those smoke places. The federal government built housing for war workers in Richmond shipyards. That housing was built for whites in the lower residential areas of Berkeley, under shopping, and for African Americans separately along the railroad tracks in the industrial area. Again, workers working in the same shipyards and the same workplaces. Well, there are many, many other policies I can describe, many of them at state level. You heard earlier about state licensing agencies that license realtors who subscribe to the National Association of Realtors, and a different name now, the National Association of State Boards maybe, who subscribe to a code of ethics that prohibited them from selling a home to a white neighbor, to a black family. Every time a state government licensed one of those realtors, one of you, who subscribed to that code of ethics, it was violating the Constitution, violating the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Well, the policies to redress segregation are well known. There's no mystery about them, so it's not hard to think of what they are. Housing experts, policy experts, journalists like me, we write about them all the time. Everybody knows what to do. What's missing is not policy ideas. What's missing is the new civil rights movement that's going to make it as difficult to sustain residential segregation as we made it difficult to sustain segregation of restaurants and buses in colleges and universities back in the 20th century. I can name a few of the policies, give you some examples. One of them, and I am writing a new book, as I've given talks like this, people read The Color of Law. They keep pestering me, well, what can we do about it? So I figured I have to give them an answer. So I have working on a new book, which is about what local activists can do, not the national government. We don't have any national consensus, but we have to build from the bottom and accumulate the national will to address these problems. What can local activists do to address segregation? Many policies can be leveraged at the local level. They vary from place to place what they are. And those policies have to really take 4 different forms. One is improving the resources in existing black neighborhoods, because we can't desegregate this country all at once. And so we need to improve the resources dramatically so that children don't come to school with greater rates of asthma and lead poisoning and homelessness and economic insecurity. And a lot of that can be done at the local level. The second area of policy is that in gentrifying neighborhoods, we need to prevent the displacement of existing residents, disproportionately African American, from those neighborhoods as prices rise. The policies to do that are well known. Some of them are permitted for local areas, as others are not, depending on the state. Rent control, limits on condominium conversions, inclusionary zoning requiring new development to have a share of units that's affordable to low and moderate income families, because moderate income African American families, as well as white families, can't afford housing in this market either. It's not just poor people with sufferings. And freezing of property taxes, so that people are not forced to sell their homes or leave their homes because they no longer pay the property taxes on them as the property values rise, even though they may own their homes in full, no mortgage. They still can't afford to live in them. And we're going to be freezing property taxes at the rate that the assessment at the time they purchased the house, and recoup the lost property taxes at the point where they sell. So if you have a homeowner who maybe purchased a home for $50,000 some years ago, and the home is now worth $400,000, and the homeowner sells, instead of making a $350,000 capital gain, they maybe only make a $300,000 gain because the lost property taxes at that point are returned to the treasury, so that the schools don't suffer, the libraries don't suffer, the fire departments don't suffer. So those policies are well known. The third area that we need to pursue is opening up those white segregated suburbs. The unconstitutionally adopted zoning rules to preserve the segregation that was initially created by explicit public policy. We need to open up those suburbs. We need to subsidize African Americans to move into those suburbs, to purchase homes, and yes, as I said, the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act, I'll use Levittown again as an example. In effect, it said to African Americans, okay, you know, you can now move to Levittown. Nobody will stop you, especially if we enforce the Fair Housing Act, which we're not doing. That is another question. But you have a right to move into Levittown now. But who's supposed to $400,000? No working class family, no middle class family can afford to buy a $400,000 home unless they have down payments from their parents. The federal government should be buying up homes in Levittown as they come for sale for $400,000 and reselling them at deeply discounted prices to African Americans. So that the population of Levittown, the black population of Levittown, begins to approach the black population of the surrounding area. There will be a narrowly targeted remedy for a very specific, explicit constitutional violation. We don't do it not because we don't know what to do. We don't do it because we know what will to do it. And the fourth area that we need to focus on is where we do open up suburban areas to African American residents. We need to have policies that stabilize their desegregation, so that white flight doesn't turn it from an all-white neighborhood and all that. And we know what to do there. I'll tell you one example that I did in my book. Oak Park, Illinois, in the 1970s, saw African Americans beginning to move into a neighborhood, and a local civil rights group decided it was going to ensure that it remained a non-segregated neighborhood. So the city adopted an insurance program against loss in property values, that people could get an insurance premium to insure them against property value loss. It's a brilliant program. It turns out they never had to pay a single policyholder because nobody's home ever lost property value. And Oak Park today is an integrated, stable neighborhood that people did not succumb to realtors' predictions that they would lose property value if they stayed in the neighborhood that black families would move into. So that's a very local policy that could be implemented. Doesn't require federal responsibility. Well, as I say, policies are well known. What's missing is a new civil rights movement. I'm supporting a group of national civil rights leaders who are trying to create a mobilization for that movement. Actually, I have a national organization directly with us here this evening, John Comer. And I hope that as it evolves, all of you will see fit to participate. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. And now I guess some questions.
Yeah, if you don't mind, we'll do a question and answer period. You want? For us? Yeah.
Should I call, do you want to call people or how do you want to? Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I often see in the media where developers are seeking permits for new housing projects, often apartments in our area, and they're approved with the commitment that the developer will reserve a certain number of the apartments for a lower income group. But I have never, ever heard of that being violated. So my question, and Sandra, you may have some comments to this, what agency is checking to make sure that 5 years down the line, that developer is maintaining that commitment?
Well, the bigger problem is that there are very few suburban jurisdictions that follow that policy. There are some. It's called, I refer to them as what they call inclusionary zoning. If they're financed by the federal government with a tax credit that's issued by the Treasury Department, the units have to remain affordable for 15 years, and the tax credits are revoked if they're not. And I haven't heard of that not being enforced. I don't think that's a big problem. What is a big problem is that obviously they need to be preserved as affordable for more than 15 years. And there is a big problem with developers trying to, it's a technicality that says it should be affordable for 30 years, but they don't lose a tax credit if they violate it after the 15-year period. And there are a lot of developers that are selling and forcing the sale of those buildings to for-profit speculators who want to kick out the affordable units. But for the first 15 years, I think it's really well enforced. That's not enough. The second 15 is to be enforced as well. But the bigger problem is getting suburbs to agree to modify their zoning laws to even permit multi-unit buildings. And let me say also that, I don't think it is a healthy building that has a share of units for low-income families and the rest is sold at the market rate. Mixed income units should have full spectrum. There's this whole missing middle of working class families, teachers, police officers, firemen, workers in retail stores, people with real jobs who can't afford housing in this market. It's not just poor people. And we should have the requirement that these developments not only set aside a share for the poor, but set aside a share for workforce families as well. So you have a development that has both market rate families, working class families, and poorer families. That's a healthier approach.
And I'd like to just add something to
Please,
that.
yeah.
That is one thing that we have been sort of implementing in council, like the ones who were saying, that the developers that actually take advantage of land use incentives and tax credits, we actually do have it set up where they would offer 80% AMI, 60% AMI, and sometimes under 30 to get that spectrum. But like you said, but with private developers, you don't have that. Unfortunately, you don't have that with them. And hopefully, like I said, with the overlay, what we're planning on doing with the benefit table, we'll be able to get some of those private developers actually, which a lot of them offer to supplement affordable housing, but they don't want it in their units. So we actually need to make sure that they actually pay a larger amount of money to even come here in Asheville and to build. So that's something where we can hold it to it. But we are working on those different levels, that middle level that you were speaking of.
This question will probably a little esoteric, but when we hear experts like yourselves talk about points in history that we look back on and say, wow, we really got it wrong on the federal policy regarding housing after World War II. We really got it wrong with No Child Left Behind. We really got it wrong with 3 strikes you're out. The law that the Clintons had for crime in the 90s. I can't even name it. But what can we be doing? And I'm saying we, maybe even in the younger generations, to be how do we know that federal policy isn't still, how do we know that there's not a new federal policy in place right now that is also, 20, we could all look back on 20, 20 years from now and go, wow, that was really racist. And it really put people at a disadvantage, or classist, it really put the poor at maybe disadvantage. We can't assume that these are all past issues. They have to be, they clearly have to also be present and future. What do we do to make sure that those things aren't sitting right underneath our nose today?
Well, first I want to point out that not every policy in the past turns out to be wrong in retrospect. We've done a lot of right things. Passed the Social Security Act, and passed the Fair Labor Standards Act, minimum wage laws. Passed Medicare in the 1960s. So it's not like we look back on every policy and say it was wrong. We have an obligation to study and to think carefully and to try to avoid mistakes. So if mistakes don't be made, But what's the alternative? Do nothing.
Sure.
And I think we have to do our best to use what educators we can and try to anticipate what the unintended consequences might be and go forward the best we can. But it's not the case that everything's done. It's been a mistake. And that, when I listened to your question, I had the feeling that that's not what you meant, but that was the implication of this, that we do these things and 20 years later we say that they were a mistake. Sometimes that's true, but not always the truth. Maybe not even most times. Yeah.
An old man talking to a young man in front of him. One of the things is to avoid knee-jerk reactions. And we have that in our history as well. And some of the things you pointed out were knee-jerk reactions to problems. And we're facing that today, and we will always face that today. One of the examples that came up in real estate in Davidson over at Charlotte was inclusionary zoning. It was one thing to get people into the housing, the development, in this case condos. It was another thing to get them to maintain them. Couldn't afford it. Therefore, in the condominium project, the ones that couldn't be maintained brought all of it down. So the people all went underwater on their original investments. And that, to me, is a knee-jerk reaction, not going far enough in terms of being able to help people. It's one thing to get them in. It's another thing to maintain and the cost of that. And I think Sandra talked to the education project, the process. It's not just buying, but if you take the responsibility of owning, you have a responsibility to do the right thing for the long term. And that's what I would tell a young person today, is to avoid those kinds of decisions if you follow the logic.
Yes.
Yeah. We hear a fair amount now about the increasing trend for reurbanization. More and more people are actually becoming interested in moving back into urban centers. Do you think this may help alleviate the problem, or do you think it ultimately is going to exacerbate the problem?
It won't help, it won't alleviate the problem unless we have conscious policies to ensure that it alleviates, it doesn't exacerbate the problem. We implemented all of these policies in the 20th century consciously, purposely discriminatory, purposely singling out African Americans. So unless we have remedies that are also conscious, that also single out the victims for remedies, we're not going to fix it. It's not going to take care of itself by itself. So people move into urban areas, you referred to something that's sometimes called gentrification. But as I referred to, you heard your councilwoman refer, that frequently results in the displacement of African Americans. it turns a segregated black neighborhood into a segregated white one. And unless you have explicit policies, conscious policies, to prevent the displacement, it simply resegregates in a different form of the neighborhood. And we've all seen this in many places around the country.
And it happens even in the most urban cities, like New York City and Harlem is a great example of gentrification happening in a very liberal urban
Yeah.
section.
Yes.
Asheville has a few initiatives to try and make homeownership more accessible to people of color and lower incomes, and those programs have struggled because the cost of investing in one person or one family to become homeowners in our area is so great. That it's hard to justify when there are less expensive strategies like multifamily units with some affordable housing that could house many more. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on the value of municipalities making large investments in individuals so that we can increase homeownership among people who haven't had that opportunity or who've been intentionally blocked from doing so.
I think we have to make large investments. It's a big problem. Asheville, I don't know anything about Asheville. I'm talking about, this part. But from everything I've heard in the 2 days I've been the value of property is going way up. All right. To me, that means that the Asheville City Treasury is probably overflowing. The taxes it's collecting from all of this increased property value. And some of that, perhaps a substantial part of that, should be used to remedy some of this the segregation that was created. And the private sector also, and the real estate industry in particular, has a responsibility. I was talking to some of your colleagues yesterday, and I said that, I asked, I said the standard commission is 6%, isn't it? 3% for the seller, 3% for the buyer. And I was told, that's an antitrust violation to say things like that. So whatever the commission is, there's a real estate group elsewhere in the country that's trying to sign realtors up to dedicate 1% of that 6% that maybe whatever they get, but dedicate 1% of that, and maybe half for the seller, half for the buyer, that's the way it works, to a fund to subsidize home ownership for African Americans that the real estate industry itself prohibited in the past. So that would be the appropriate response. The notion that this is going to take care of it by itself, or it's going to be free, is I think not sustainable. Yes.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you. Big fan of your book, but thank you for not sugarcoating any of this. And I think that sharing the history as it happened is really important. And also to all Buncombe County residents in the room, you talked a lot about taking actual action. Right now, County Council, they created an ad hoc committee because research found that property tax assessment in the county is inequitable. And basically, if your home is worth $225,000, it gets assessed at $225,000 versus if it's worth more than that, it gets statistically, it's not every single home, but assessed at less than that. So you're paying less property taxes than you should be for your home. Whereas if your property is worth less than $225,000, it gets assessed higher than that. So you're paying more property taxes than you should be. So the county council created an ad hoc committee, and they've been working to figure out policy solutions, getting educated on the issue, having speakers come in. So that's something that I encourage all of you to keep track of on the county website. Go to those meetings. They have opportunities for public comment and get engaged in that process, because that's something that's happening right here that is affecting a lot of homeowners when their property taxes are increasing 5 times every time they go through another reassessment.
Absolutely, and that's a national phenomenon. True.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. Richard?
Oh, okay, yeah. I'd like to thank you for giving so many examples as to things that can be done to actually help the situation. And one of them, basically, like you were talking about, to invest in the Black communities. And this is the issue, because a lot of people think when gentrification happens, this is what I'm finding out. It's like they're trying to prevent companies or developers from coming in because they say, we don't want to gentrify area more. But resources are needed to actually make sure that neighborhood can actually, begin to sustain itself. And I'm finding that as a big issue. And of course, we do the thing with, when they had opportunity zones, or whatever. Opportunity zones have not been real effective in actually doing anything in these communities. What do you suggest we could do? Because that's one thing here at Asheville. They've got Black areas, but there's no services, there's no grocery stores, there's no banks. I mean, it makes no sense. And they keep talking about the expenses of doing it, and private investors are not going to go in. Well, what do we do? What would you suggest we do about that?
Well, I suggested before, on the new ideas, we need to implement policies that prevent displacement at the same time that we encourage resource improvement in those neighborhoods. The best way to get banks and improve supermarkets into that neighborhood is to start to gentrify. Because when middle-class people move into the neighborhood, the banks and the grocery stores will follow. What you have to do also, though, at the same time, is implement policies that prevent displacement of existing residents. So that you can develop a healthy, non-segregated neighborhood. There are some people, I don't know if this is what you were thinking, it's not what you were alluding to, but there are some African Americans who don't want improved resources in their community because they say, we want.
They can keep that control and people come in and take over. That's exactly right. So it's a catch-22. Yeah.
Well, it's, separate but equal doesn't work in housing any more than it does in schools or restaurants or anywhere else. If you want a healthy neighborhood, you can't keep it segregated. You can't keep it all Black because people want to move in. But you also don't have to succumb to it becoming all white. If you implement the kinds of policies to prevent displacement that I described. So you need to do both. But one thing you can't do, you can try, but it won't work, is to improve the quality of the neighborhood and then keep it only a resident of a place where low-income Black people live.
Okay, Tim?
How do you connect with this new civil rights movement that you talked about? And what's it called? How do you follow it? How do we engage?
John, can you stand up? This is John Comer. He's the National Organizing Director. We can walk to him later. I don't know, if you want, I'll talk to David about it or Matt. If you want information about it when it launches in this area, I suppose we can send that an email to those who are in attendance. Is there anybody who objects to their name being on that list? All right, well, I'll talk to you and see if we can do that. Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
I want to thank the National Association and NC Realtors for your support in this event. I want to thank Lockhart staff for making it successful. I want to thank you all for being here. And I especially want to thank our speakers. This was so excellent. And thank you, Richard, for traveling here to be with us in person. Okay, let's see. Great.